Welcome to the Healthing podcast. I am Ushma, founder of Ripple.
And I'm Thomas Blok, director of the Federation for Health in the Netherlands.
Ever feel like staying healthy is just too hard? Like the system is set up to make it more difficult than it should be?
You're not alone. Our health systems focus on treating disease, not preventing it. And our environments, from food to air to work, often make it worse.
In this podcast, we'll explore how to make healthing easy and accessible for everybody.
Together, we'll uncover how to build systems that prioritize well-being, not just profits.
So whether you're a policymaker, a health professional, or just passionate about a healthier world,
Healthing is for you. Join us.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Healthing podcast with Thomas and I. We're super excited to welcome James Storch today. And we did just have a discussion and clarification on the pronunciation of the name, because it does come from Schleswig-Holstein in Germany. So being raised in Germany, I would pronounce it Stauch, but the anglicized version of the name is Storch. So that's why James Storch. He's a leading thinker, a practitioner in the world of complex systems and social innovation and citizen-driven change. James recently has written a book called 55 Minutes. It's an amazing book for everyone. Definitely, you have to read it. It's a powerful call to slow down and deepen our understanding of problems before rushing to solve them. We're super excited to have you here with us, James. Welcome to the Healthing podcast.
Welcome. Yeah.
Welcome. And I'll just hand it over to you to let us know who you are, what drove you to write the book, and give us a bit of background. Set the stage for us.
Thank you, Ushma and Thomas. It's really a pleasure to be part of the Healthing podcast and speaking with you today. This morning on this side of the Atlantic. The book, it was developed with Anna Johnson, who is based in Western Canada, in Calgary, and a US-based writer, Daniela Pappy-Thornton, who has a very interesting background. She's currently in Colorado, but she ran a program at the Scholl Center for Social Entrepreneurship at the University of Oxford, where she developed a very interesting student competition called Map the System that's still running. It's a global competition that universities and colleges participate in. And it's all about understanding a problem, not solving a problem, understanding a problem, which is very unique. When we embarked on the book, we were very privileged as well to be connected to a company, ATCO, which is, again, a Canada-based company, but with a global reach. And ATCO is very interested in thinking about how engaging with complexity, and thinking in systems, which we'll talk a lot more about in this conversation, is actually essential when you're thinking about corporate longevity, resilience, anti-fragility, even in a commercial context. So our world is generally a kind of social impact background or education background, but we've teamed up with the company who's underwritten the book to make it relevant to the commercial sector as well. The book takes its inspiration from an alleged Albert Einstein quote, where he said, "If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would spend the first 55 minutes just thinking about the problem and the last 5 minutes thinking about solutions." And our premise for this is that, well, we live really in a context of modernity, and especially in the Western world, we are all about that last 5 minutes. It's about strategizing, planning, brainstorming, ideating, designing. All of the things we do to act are in that kind of 5 minutes. But we don't really have much of an emphasis on, well, how do we really understand the problem?
Yeah.
Are we actually dealing with the right problem, or is this a symptom of a much deeper problem? So that's what set us off.
And when did Einstein inspire you in your career? Because this is not something what's happened overnight, I would say. Is it?
No, in fact, I mean, even when we started the book 5 years ago,
Yeah.
we started storyboarding and we had a very banal title, kind of working title for the book, something along the lines of A Practitioner's Guide to Mapping a System. Well, I mean, you fall asleep before the end of that title.
Yeah.
And so we knew that wasn't going to be it. And we needed a more powerful metaphor.
But you
And
personally, as a person, because you started off as a what is your background and what training and where did you start? Because this
Oh,
is
sure. Yeah. I'm
yeah,
so I'm technically
yeah,
trained to be an urban planner, although I probably wouldn't get a license today because I haven't really worked in the field for many decades. Um, and I got into planning because I was really interested in cities and how cities work and how they could work better. And I naively assumed that planners created great cities and that planning was responsible for really great experiences, cities you want to visit, cities you want to be in. But when you actually look at those kinds of places, where do we travel to and we spend time in an urban context? Almost always they are unplanned spaces. So that led me to a bit of an existential crisis
when was that?
and wondering whether
When
I
was
was
that? 20 years ago, or how long?
well, it's a bit longer than that, but thank you.
Really? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
No, I'm 52 now, and so that
Me
would have
too.
been
I'm 50 as well. Yeah. Yeah.
in the late 90s. Um, and um, and it's I went I'm old enough to have gone to planning school before they taught Jane Jacobs, for example. Jane Jacobs um, was outside of academia, not a no peer reviews on her writing, um, was emphatically a kind of citizen-based perspective, but deeply observational. And I would consider Jane Jacobs to be a perfect example of a systems thinker, somebody who thought not just about how cities work and all of the complexity of the interaction of a street or a neighborhood or a commercial strip, but also about education, about government, about democracy,
Yeah.
about all these things
Also
that are
about
connected.
healthcare, I presume.
Yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So you embarked around 2000 into systems thinking, and it brought you a rich career, a new book, also a work at ATCO. We will discuss it a bit later. But I wonder, when you started uh, to do that, to make that career change, where did you start? What was the first steps in uh, starting to work on the if societies are unplanned, the most pleasant to live in, what are then the learnings, and especially also reflecting on health thing, the term that we coin. So, can you shed some light how you lived that life? So after the around the millennium, and that you brought to what you're doing now, actually. How,
Yeah, so I was really fortunate to have been given an opportunity. It was a summer job initially, that kept expanding into more and more interesting opportunities. But initially, it was just a summer job to drive my Nissan Sentra about 16 to 18 hours north, directly north of Calgary, into a subarctic community in the Northwest Territories. So north of Alberta, the kind of place that in the summer the sun barely sets or doesn't set at all. And I that's a region, just for context, where the imprint of European colonialism is decades old, not centuries old, in any meaningful sense. And what that means is cultures and ways of living and ways of governing language and so on are still relatively strong as compared with other parts of the Americas. and also Indigenous people are the majority or close to the majority in those regions. And so they also still carry a lot of political weight. That combination produces new arrangements and new possibilities for rethinking governance, rethinking resource management, rethinking really everything, justice, health, education, you name it. Um, and and it opened my eyes to a completely different way of, well, looking at planning, for example, but also looking at really every other aspect of how we choose to organize our societies and intervene in what we may construct or formulate as social problems, whether those are problems of poverty or ill health or what we in the West would call underdevelopment and so on.
Yeah,
Wow,
Completely new and novel to me.
wow.
so
And
how can we imagine that? So how completely different? You mentioned before no schools, no hospitals, like things that we cannot imagine how to organize society. How could that look like without schools and without hospitals, for example? Or no prisons, you
Well,
also.
yeah, and I should be clear that, um, there's enough of a modern imprint that schools and hospitals do exist in these places. It's just that I think there's still a kind of collective memory and sense of the Americas pre-contact were places where institutions that we take for granted simply did not exist. There were no prisons, there were no schools, there were no hospitals, um, there was no state welfare for children, for example, kids in care systems and things like this. And so people had different ways of dealing with either whether it was deemed to be social deviance or ill health or whatever the case. Different cultures had different ways of dealing with it and created their own institutions that would be quite distinct from ours. And so what you see in the North are sort of hybridized models that draw from Western models, but also draw from Indigenous
and
traditions. Um, and that's fascinating to see
yeah,
that kind of combination unfold.
sounds really fascinating. What I wonder, because you are saying that we are complexity, because one of the key learnings that you refer to Einstein, 55 minutes, we need to think and understand, which is also a plea for complexity thinking, where connections, contextualization is really important to get a grasp and understand what's happening there before you go to do anything. So you highlighted as a key message or key starting point for writing the book, but I presume that your early experience in the up north of Canada was really also inspiring you, amongst other key learnings that your work was you were telling you was telling about. Did you, or is so? My question would be, what are the key values, and are they related to what we are saying in complexity science, where we have feedback loops and you have contextualization and connection? If you have to give to the flavor of those values that are are distinct in those hybrid communities, yeah, to what Ushma is asking, the imagination of what sort of principles or values are leading there then, and
I mean, it's really interesting because as we started doing our background research for this book, and the book is, broadly speaking, it's split into two large sections. The first part of the book, the first third or so, we call foundations. And so this is kind of ways of thinking and working. So for example, we talk about, so what does a systems-led approach or systems practice ask or demand of us as practitioners? And as what kind of habits or what kind of modes of thinking are useful? whether we're managers or leaders or entrepreneurs or investors or planners or policymakers or students and educators or healthcare professionals or activists or advocates of one sort or another. How do you approach your own thinking? How do you frame and reframe a problem? How do you kind of leave a solution aside until you really understand context, as you mentioned? And that context may be the market conditions. It may be the cultural context or the economic and political environment and so on. And so as we were doing that section, we leaned partially on the insights of complexity theorists and system scientists who, starting with some of the folks at MIT that are now quite famous, Jay Forrester and Donella Meadows and so on, through some of the current really interesting thinkers on complexity. I mean, people like Gene Bolton and David Snowden and Patrick Haverstadt and Michael Jackson. These are really interesting academics who have contributed a lot of new thinking or integrative thinking to help make sense of systems from a scholarly standpoint. But really importantly, systems thinking, we contend, is not new. So it is something, in fact, I would argue that it is the natural way for human beings to think for most of human history.
That's also the key message of Gene Bolton, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And
the
I
Tao,
think
the Tao is 1,500 years old or something like that, 1,500.
absolutely, and in many ways, a guidebook to systems thinking.
But she said that she recognized the resonance. It's one-on-one when you have complexity science and the Tao. Could you say, from your experience with the Indigenous people in North Canada, that there is a similarity, that the way the values of that societies are also based on that maybe universal way of how life unfolds itself, or maybe I'm.
Oh yes, in many ways. So, for example, a recurring statement that you often hear Indigenous elders say is that everything is connected to everything, and that's quite literally true, and quite literally um, uh, how they would see the world. The other piece of that is that everything is connected, but also everything is animate. Everything is in a flow state, and not just living beings. It's obvious that animals are animate. It's increasingly obvious that plants are animate, and fungi. But what about rocks? What about a manufactured object? A pen.
Yeah.
These are also animate in an indigenous worldview, or many indigenous worldviews would contend that. And then the other piece of that that's connected is the fundamental nature of reality is relationship. So we might say in a Western frame, or at least pre-quantum physics Western frame, we would say, the fundamental nature of reality is whatever the smallest thing we can find, whether that is an atom, whether that is a quark, whether that is some kind of something smaller than a quark. And so our thinking is not only that the fundamental nature of reality is a thing, is a particle of some kind, but that the extent to which we can discover what that fundamental nature is and reduce reality to that will unlock, in a sense, the theory of everything, right? The ultimate key to understanding the universe.
James,
Well,
yeah, may I?
and I just, that has to be contrasted with that indigenous viewpoint of, but what if relationships are the fundamental reality? What if it's not the thing, but it's the connection between the things? And what if the things themselves are nothing but relationships as well.
And
And so this is really interesting. And this is where the Tao, this is where there's so much consistency and resonance with the Tao in that sense.
I want to bring it to what Ushma always also asked was, we have our listeners or people watching this podcast to make it more. How does it look like in practice? For instance, what you're saying, if I presume my hypothesis would be that indigenous people are more in relation and are close to nature and have built their society on how to on complexity science actually. But how does it look like? You said earlier, there were no schools or there were no prisons, there was no an hospital. So our Ushma and I are coining the idea of healthing, which is based upon complexity science, I would say. And presumably, I maybe we have implicitly the indigenous people how they dealt with their health was more or less the healthing way. But maybe so. I would like
Yes.
to invite you to reflect upon that idea, because I think the key topic, and that's also why it's so interesting that you are working for that corporate business, ATCO, where we can try to learn how to can we manifest this way of thinking in our societies, because that's where the challenge presumably lies, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I one of the kind of commandments of the Church of Silicon Valley is the Mark Zuckerberg maxim that you need to move fast and break stuff. But of course, when it comes to the social sphere, when dealing with often very tricky human dynamics like dementia or refugee resettlement or youth gang involvement, moving fast and breaking stuff means the stuff you're going to break are ultimately human beings. And so that maxim might work in tech, but it doesn't, but it breaks down the minute you introduce human beings into that equation. And so, what is interesting is, when I first started working in the North, um, I was impatient. I was eager to get things done. I was idealistic. I thought, you go into a community and you observe a little bit and you conduct what we might say in international development is a rapid rural appraisal, let's say, and you come up with an answer, a solution, and try and peddle that or hustle that solution. And that's a really stupid idea because people will laugh at you. People will be bemused if you have that approach, or they might justifiably be offended, because this is the approach that um, far too many government officials, far too many companies, far too many NGOs, all of the so-called well-meaning people who want to help or do good or make a change and go into environments where they lack enough context, but they have a solution or they have the desire to create a solution. This
They
is a
want to
kind of
sell us.
Western, you could call this a Western disease. This is, we need to get to the solution quickly. And it's important to slow down and think, and not just think, but to be in relationship and to listen, to engage. And so I'll give you an example. I many years later worked for a foundation that was quite interested in the North. We were interested in helping. There's that word again. The North or Northern peoples, Northern communities get a fair deal when it came to natural resource revenue, whether it was oil and gas, whether it was gold, iron, other rare earth minerals, and so on. Um, how do you ensure that communities benefit in such a way that those communities thrive in the way they want to thrive and are able to have enough financial and economic autonomy and freedom to to become the communities they wish to be on their own terms? And is it even possible that the revenue from the sale of natural resources can be post-colonial and do that and accomplish that? So we thought, well, okay, let's convene a process. And so we had the process in a high school gymnasium north of the Arctic Circle in a small community called Fort Good Hope, presciently named, on the Mackenzie River. Beautiful community with the people were amazingly hospitable. I don't recall there being any hotel or motel in the community, so everyone was billeted out to private families. So you really had a chance over a number of days to meet people in the community. And it was very important that the process incorporate and invite all members of the community, regardless of age or status. So it's not just the mayor, it's not just the local lands and resource people. It's literally everyone, whether you're 5 or 95. And everyone who comes has a seat at the table. And so we had a giant, like, circular table in the middle of the gym where on the first day, not too many people from the community came. They were just like, who are these outsiders? What are they up to? What's going on here? And by the way, we also had a mix of like NGOs, companies, industry advocates, policymakers, um, local and regional leaders. So it's quite a mix, and people from right across the political spectrum, from activists to people who wanted to get that resource exploited as quickly as possible. And by day 3, there was a dance, a community dance. All of us were welcome and invited to the dance. But by that, it was part of the structure of the thing. The people who helped facilitate this said it's really important if you're going to the community that you have a feast, that you invite the community to the feast, and you have music and you have drumming and you have prizes or whatever it's going to take for people to come out. And yes, at the end of the night, you can come up, get to the mic, and tell people a little bit about why you're here. Well, the next day, the gym was packed, and everyone had a chance to say something. And by the end of it, uh, we didn't have action plans, we didn't have strategies, we didn't have um, anything that in a Western frame you would consider a concrete takeaway. What we had was relationships, trust, momentum, energy, goodwill, and that meant so much more, and
Point
so much
taken,
more for the
James.
communities.
Point taken. So don't ask for concrete. Don't let yourself be sucked into the existing frame, and to ask for concrete. Just invest in relationship. Very good, Ushma. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question because
Nice. Yeah.
so James's beautiful story. Thank you for sharing this with us because I think it really makes it tangible what complexity science is all about and what it means to have the smallest thing, to have the fundamental thing is a thing rather than a relationship. Like what that means. I think this example really shows that. I have a question because not everyone understands this, right? How do we get people that are completely educated and living in the Western model of institutions and silos and things? How do we get them to understand relationships and this case, for example, as well? How do we get those two things together? Don't we need to find a way to translate what a relationship is versus in the language of not so much complexity science thinkers? You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, one thing that's always useful is to start simple and to start with. I contend that complexity doesn't simply exist with so-called wicked problems or mega messes or whatever name you want to assign it. Things like climate change, things like housing affordability. These are, uh, mental health crisis among young people, social anxiety. The list goes on and on and on and on. And geopolitics right now, those are emphatically complex, but we sometimes make the mistake of saying, well, those are the only complex problems. But actually, you find complexity in very small niche places. Every single business, whether it's for profit or nonprofit, is a complex system. Um, the minute you have, um, let's say you have 16 people in a given system. So that's a small size firm, for example, or an extended family. Um, those people, when you count the number of different permutations, possible relationships with each other or with groups of others, and the dynamics that change. So think of your own family. You have a slightly different relationship with your parents or with your children or with your cousins, but each cousin is a different kind of relationship. It also depends on, are the cousins together as a group? Are they there with an uncle or an aunt or etc.? And everything changes depending on what those combinations are. And so, complexity theorists have worked this out to be, for example, 64,000 plus connections are possible with just 16 players, 16 people. Well, already you're into an immense amount of complexity in a family or company context. And so that may be helpful for people to start to think about, oh, yeah, right. Raising a child or navigating a romantic relationship is not something that lends itself to any kind of replicable recipe, no matter how complex or how many steps that recipe might have. It is nonlinear, it is non-binary, um, and it is constantly dynamic, constantly in flux. So that would be one entry point that is sometimes useful for people where they go, oh, yeah, right. Okay. I get it now. I get what you're talking about. The other thing is simply to say, a surgeon and health writer, Atul Gawande, he says that one essential characteristic of modern life is that we all depend on systems all the time. So, and he describes these as assemblages of people or technologies or both. Um, and we simply have trouble making them work. So we often say the system is broken, or we can't fight the system, or this is a systemic problem of, and then fill in the blank, right? And we find this in our workplaces. Why can't this organization or this company change? We all seem to think the same thing. We all seem to understand the vector that we want to be on, and yet stubbornly it doesn't change. And so you see this in healthcare systems all the time, right? Whether it's in my country, in Canada, the search for a family doctor has become kind of a joke at this point. In many parts of the country, it's just simply not possible to find a general practitioner, a family doctor. Wait times for emergency clinics are often into the hours, or space in hospitals is overcrowded, especially during flu season, or any kind of flare up. The cost of pharmaceuticals can be astronomical, catastrophically so, even in a system like ours that is quasi-universal. And these all point to systemic failures. Um, Even when we see governments pouring more and more money into that system. Um, and so, right there, people are like, oh, right, we say systems all the time. The system is broken, but we don't actually to internalize what that
so in
means.
our narrative, how we talk about society sectors, we are still fragmenting, and so it's still in our DNA that we are linear thinkers, and we should get rid of that. So that's your advice, actually, to say, okay, we need to see it another way. So in that way, we need to build our consciousness, or being more conscious, talk about it, a new narrative. Maybe in your term, when you started, when you were naive, maybe we are naive with our as well, but certainly we become wiser. And so the point then is, you said that, and maybe that this is also because time's flying. So I want to go to an end of this podcast, but the question, maybe you could reflect a bit on that, is we need skills to or rediscover how relationships works and build a consciousness about it. And that maybe it's good to address that from the corporate business angle, where, because I wonder how your organization ATCO, where you work for, the organization you work for, how do they do that? Because that maybe there are some learnings that may help us to build our the consciousness of people, that we build another narrative, but also start become wiser in dealing with complexity. Maybe this is also the goal of your book, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, the second big piece of the book is really 11 chapters, and that number is very specific because we use the metaphor of an analog clock. So if you picture a clock on a wall, the first 11 5-minute increments constitute 55 minutes, but each of those 11 chapters has a name and has a question, a kind of convening question attached to it. So, for example, we start off with the chapter called Frame. Well, frame is all about, if you picture, a camera, where do we actually focus and how do we set the boundaries? Like, where is this system? And by the way, no two people will share a definition of a system, right? Where does the education system begin? Or well, let's talk about health. What is the health system? Where does it begin and end? Do people even think it exists? Some people say, well, it's a healthcare system. That's formally what it's called often. But others are like, it's not remotely about healthcare. It's about sick care. And, so that right away the debate begins, even trying to name the thing. But then who's in, who's out? How much of the preventative landscape, how much around nutrition, how much around healthy lifestyles, urban planning, everything plays into it.
Point taken. Completely agree.
So frame, but you still have to frame, because it's a skill. In order to communicate what you're talking about, you do need to set an arbitrary frame and sort of defend it, but also be willing to reframe and reframe and reframe. So we have a whole chapter.
One of the 11 chapters, maybe, yeah. So and the other chapters are what sort of other?
So very briefly: landscape, roots, origins, futures, experience, relationships, power, causality, narrative, and leverage. Those are the sort of families of tools where there are 30 tools that we go into considerable detail around, that we think by the way, they're not all systems tools per se. They're just tools for understanding a problem in a deeper way, or from a different angle,
mapping
or
the
in a thoughtful way.
Mapping the system, taking 55 minutes for it, and then being there, start to think about maybe or not what you're going to do, and your organization ATCO, because maybe that's the final question for now. Maybe Ushma has also one question, but for me the final question would be, if those are the tools, is this commercial organization able to absorb those and work alongside those principles? That's you hear my wondering, or my question in it, that I want to, wow, are they doing that?
Well, I mean, most institutions in society are on very short-term horizons, right? So quarterly meetings, quarterly board meetings, or annual shareholder meetings, or election cycles, or funder cycles if you're an NGO. But there are some institutions in society that are interested in stepping back a little bit and thinking a little more long term. And here is one. ATCO is a Western Canada-based company with a global ambit, about 21,000 employees, and it is still very much a family-run company. It is publicly traded, but the family still has a controlling interest. And in part because of that, there's a real interest in legacy, in making sure the company exists 50, 100, maybe even 500 years from now. Well, that's a really interesting question. What actually builds corporate longevity and maybe even corporate immortality? If you actually went through the mental exercise of what would it take for this company to be around in 100 years, that would very quickly lead you to embracing many of these tools or many of these ways of thinking as a management and leadership approach. And so ATCO is very interested in building in systems tools as part of a culture of professional development among all its employees, in particular management, but certainly among the whole company, because they see it as essential to building in resilience, anti-fragility, and longevity, sustainability writ large, right? What's going to keep this company around? So when you start to unpack what are all those systems principles, that starts to make a lot of sense. So one of the great kind of formulations that comes out of system science is this notion of Ashby's law of requisite variety. So this notion that a system, in order to maintain itself over the long term, needs to have more possible states than its surrounding environment. That kind of stems from evolution, right? If a species has more possible states or more possible forms, it's better prepared to weather some kind of cataclysm rather than a species where every member of that species is basically the same. So because of that requisite variety, that diversity in species type, some will adapt to a warmer climate or to a wetter climate or to a drier climate or whatever the case may be. And that is just as true in human institutions. If you can cultivate enough variety within the company, meaning, and then what does that look like? That looks like very diverse investments, future-focused investments, some of which won't pan out, some of which will pan out beautifully. So for example, we hear a lot of talk about the circular economy. Well, if it is indeed true that 100 years from now, we will have thoroughly embraced a circular economy, that behooves a company today to be experimenting with, to be investing in that, to be curious about that, as one possible future state.
Wow.
And so those are really simple systems principles that if a company starts to incorporate, it can potentially do very well in the long term.
Wow. Ushma, yeah, I'm looking at the time because
Yes, I do. But
now
as usual, I do have still a couple of questions, but I'll keep it to one. Just one important
keep it to one,
question.
yes.
And then I'll try to keep it short. So, so I really love that you highlighted that even in systems that we have today or Western kind of thinking that we have that is very siloed and focused on things, that the intention is still good to want to help or want to solve problems, or the intention is yes, good. I wonder what my question is about this notion that systems fail, but there is also a bit of thinking around systems are not failing, they're actually doing exactly what is meant to be doing. So that means that if there is a systems failure, that we see something or we miss something that is creating that failure, but we're not seeing it yet because we think the system is intending to do something else, but it's doing the failure part, right? So I wonder, the intention is good, but it's turning out to be something else. That means we are not seeing something in the system. How do we see what we're not seeing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the great cyberneticist Stafford Beer, who delivered Canada's most prestigious series of lectures called the Massey Lectures back in 1971. 71. So what, 54 years ago. He said it's really important to not accept at face value what the system says it's about or aspires to be about.
Okay.
The purpose of the system is what it actually does,
Yeah.
not what it says it does. So for example, a corrections system is not at all about corrections. A healthcare system is not about like it's about sick care. It's about what happens after you're injured or sick. It is not about health fundamentally. And I mean, I don't have to tell you that that's what you're all about.
That's healthy. What we are trying to do to elaborate and discuss it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, democracy itself, right? It aspires to be or makes the claim to be ruled by the people. Well, once you start interrogating that just a little bit, that breaks down pretty quickly. We don't live for the most part in societies that resemble anything close to what I think a rich democracy would require. And we do that consentingly. We often do that willingly, and that's fine. But we make claims about things that are not claimable often, and we name systems things that are not remotely what the system actually accomplishes.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you.
So it's important to question at all times.
Yeah. My answer to your question, Ushma, would be that the tools or the book, if we take the book from James and his co-authors as a central starting point, that you try to be in sync, continuously syncing with where you are. And from there, you will be able to detect the potentially you have, and you take 55 minutes for it. Eventually, you might have, better what to do about the system failures where you're talking about. So taking more time, relax, but also sink in with your context, understanding, feeling, having the relationships. If you have organized that in a certain way and you let it organize itself, then apparently, eventually, hopefully, we can do much better also in healthcare than we do now. And maybe that's the take-home message that I take from here. And eventually, maybe, James, I hope this is not the final time that we met, but I really enjoy to bring this further because your thinking is great. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share with you and have such a rich discussion. And it went in directions I didn't anticipate. So that's really cool. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. I did it. That's being in actually do what we are promoting, isn't it? Being in tune, syncing with who you are, building a relationship, then see what's happening and try to come with a nice podcast, I think. So thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, James.
Maybe this is a good moment to stop the recording.
Thank you.
And for all of our listeners, remember there will be a link attached to this podcast as well about where you can purchase the 55 minutes book. Do read it. It's really marvelous. And thank you, James, for taking the time to speak with us today. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for welcoming on your show.
Thank you.
Healthing Podcast. We'll explore how to make healthing easy and accessible for everybody.
Healthing is for you. Join us.